Namaskar. This is Akhilesh Bhargava. Welcome to Tit-Bits on Business and Finance with me. Whenever a corporate, banking, tax, or financial fraud is found out, or any large crime or money laundering is unearthed, it is of course expected that the beneficiaries of these crimes, the perpetrators of these crimes, are going to be investigated and punished by the law. But then, one common question that always arises whenever these crimes surface is what were the independent directors and what were the statutory auditors doing when these crimes were being committed and perpetrated by the promoters of the entities, by those who were in charge of management of these entities? After all, if an auditor is vigilant and exercises due care and caution, then any fraud, any crime would be detected at a very early stage such that it would be prevented from becoming big, and perhaps very often it might just not be committed at all. Because if an auditor is vigilant and alert, the management is going to be dissuaded and discouraged from indulging in any such crimes. An alert auditor prevents the crime, or at least ensures that the financial crime is minimized. Take the case of ILFS. The fraud was found out sometime in September 2018. At that time, the public money involved in the fraud was to the tune of 1,32,000 crores. This very entity had a public exposure of merely 20,000 crores in the year 2012, and frauds were being committed in ILFS. Manipulation was taking place right from the year 2009 onwards. If the auditor of ILFS had been vigilant and alert and careful in 2009, 10 or 11, then in that case, the crime would have been found out, and it would have been found out when the public exposure, the public money at stake was far lower than what it was when the fraud broke out in September 2018, and the amount of public money at stake was 1,32,000 crores. According to us, auditors are specially to blame, and we would call their conduct to be very collusive when they do not exercise basic due diligence, basic tests. They do not perform basic elementary audit checks, and because of that, crimes take place, frauds take place. An auditor gets blamed more so where the fraud committed is not deep-rooted or sophisticated and could have been found out just by committing basic elementary audit checks, and the auditor failed to do. Such an auditor, according to us, is not negligent or incompetent. The auditor to us is a collusive auditor. Basic checks are omitted, and when basic checks are omitted, to us, it's a blatant crime. Take the case of Satyam. In Satyam's case, the company was booking bogus sales, and because of that, it was also showing a bogus bank balance by way of fixed deposits in banks of over 5,000 crores. The auditors never bothered to call the banks or seek a confirmation directly from the banks whether such bank balances actually exist. They were never there. If the auditor had just made one telephone call to the bank managers, he would have come to know that the bank balances by way of fixed deposits of over 5,000 crores being claimed by Satyam do not exist, and the fraud could have been prevented. The auditors never did that. They failed to exercise what we call a very elementary and fundamental and basic audit check, and the fraud continued. That also happened in the case of Wirecard Germany very recently. EY were the auditors. Wirecard was claiming that it had fixed deposits in a bank to the tune of 1.9 billion euros. That fixed deposit was never there. And EY never bothered to seek a direct confirmation from the bankers who were holding this fixed deposit, and the fraud continues. We saw that happening in the case of PMC. We saw that happening in the case of DHFL, where monies were siphoned away to the tune of thousands of crores just by opening bogus loan accounts, bogus borrower accounts. That could have been easily checked and prevented by the auditors. They never did that. They never performed the most elementary audit function, which is seek a direct confirmation. And because of that, it continued. An auditor is expected to be reasonably alert, skeptic, and be reluctant in accepting any financial statements from the management which he thinks could be doubtful. In all these cases, whether Satyam or Wirecard or PMC or DHFL, the auditor was not skeptical. The auditor was not alert. The auditor was not willing to question what was presented to him, and resultantly, the frauds took place. Very elementary processes sacrificed. To justify this kind of misconduct on the part of the auditors like to very often give their very favorite dialogue that they are watchdogs and they are not bloodhounds, and that they are not detectives and they are not expected to unearth frauds. We think this statement is far away from the reality, is far away from the legal position as it is. In a recent representation to the authorities by the auditors in Britain, the auditors contended that it is not the duty of the auditor to look out for frauds in the entity that he is auditing. They also said that auditors do not need to look out for non-compliance with any law, and that it is also not their duty to point out any significant business risk that the entity might be facing. They said that they are not detectives and that their only job is to report whether accounting and audit standards which are mandatorily applicable to a company have been complied with or not. They reiterated that an auditor is a watchdog and not a bloodhound. We think that this contention of the auditors is far away from the reality today, is far away from the practical reality and also the legal reality. And this contention of theirs is founded on the famous judgment of Britain which was rendered in 1896 in the case of Kingston Cotton Mills. In that judgment, the judge said that an auditor must only exercise what he calls reasonable care, caution and skill, and that where there is no suspicion, the auditor can get away with very little inquiry. The judge then said that auditors are not detectives and that they do not have to approach their work with suspicion or with a foregone conclusion that something is wrong. The auditors, he said, are justified in relying on all those tried and trusted servants of the company on which even the company relies. And then the judge said that famous line that auditors are watchdogs and not bloodhounds. And this dialogue has been carried forward by the audit community right from 1896 to today in the year 2021. As we said, it is now 2021 and not the 1890s when the judgment of Kingston Cotton Mills was rendered. Today, the entire scene has changed drastically, legally as well as practically, and the expectations of the auditors have undergone a huge change. The laws were different in the 1890s. They are totally different now. In the 1890s, there was no compulsion for every company to appoint an auditor, and nor was there a need to prepare audited financial statements. The laws were different. The laws did not enshrine what is the role, responsibility, and duty of an auditor as it is done today. And there were no mandatory accounting and audit standards as they are now. Thus, trying to resort to a judgment of 1896 to justify the conduct or rather the misconduct of auditors now is completely wrong. It is totally cut away from reality. And this point was very well made recently by the chairman of the NFRA, the National Financial Reporting Authority, which is India's independent audit regulator. The chairman of NFRA said that forget this dialogue of watchdog and bloodhound. It is completely irrelevant. He said that auditors today need to approach audits with a sense of skepticism, with a questioning mind, alert to the possibility that there could be an error, whether intentional or otherwise. The auditors need to be sitting with a questioning mind, trying to see whether the statements or the data given to them have any kind of an error. And if the errors are deliberate, then of course they have unearthed a fraud. Thus, you cannot approach work with a mindset that rely on what is given by the management and it must be correct. He then said very rightly that in today's times, the auditor's duties and responsibilities are very well defined, and so are the mandatory accounting and audit standards. In his opinion, very rightly, meticulous compliance with laws is needed. And then he makes an interesting point. He says that auditors are expected to have a forward-looking mindset from a going concern perspective. And thus, if there are any significant or material business risks that an entity is facing, they must be reported. He then emphasized very rightly on the need for auditors to be independent at any cost. He gave the example of Arthur Andersen and Enron. Arthur Andersen, which has now been disbanded, used to get an audit fees of $25 million from Enron. Against that, it also gave consulting services, and in that, it earned a fees of $27 million. Very clearly, its independence had already been compromised, and we saw what kind of a giant fraud took place in Enron, to which Anderson was clearly a party to. These were the remarks of the chairman of NFRA, which today is India's independent audit regulator and has been regulating the audit profession. The larger picture, according to us, is the entire audit structure has changed. It's part of a law and it is required to be mandatorily adhered to by the auditors. This entire dialogue of watchdog and bloodhound does not really hold relevant anymore. To us, failure to perform any basic audit check or elementary checks is a collusion in the crime, even if the auditor may have done it unintentionally. After all, the auditor is expected to exercise reasonable care, caution, and skill, and if that is not exercised, to us, it amounts to a collusion. Further, independence of auditors is a must and must be protected at any cost. And as part of that, to us, an auditor needs support and protection from the government, particularly where the promoters of an entity are powerful and they can go against the auditor in case he is reporting a truth which does not support the interests of those promoters. To us, the duty of the auditors today is much wider. It includes the detection of frauds. It includes compliance with laws. It includes looking into significant business risks and reporting them. And of course, it includes compliance with mandatory accounting and audit standards. To us, this role of the auditor is only going to expand more and more as more and more public money comes into the hands of promoters of listed entities and otherwise. They are expected to keep a very direct check on the managements which are managing those monies. The reality is that it is the shareholders of a company who appoint the auditors, and they are ultimately responsible to the shareholders of the company, and their primary duty is to keep a check on the management and protect the interests of the shareholders who have reposed faith in them and who have appointed them. And that means they need to be alert, they need to be skeptic, they need to be willing to question, and they need to be extremely vigilant so that frauds are prevented. This is Akhilesh Bhargava signing off till we meet again. Namaskar.
Hello everyone. HW News English is 2 years old now. When we started this venture, we promised ourselves one thing, that news should remain free, because right to know is the right of every Indian. But to keep news free for everyone, we need support from some of you. And thus we have rolled out membership on our YouTube channel HW News English. But mind you, the membership is completely voluntary. The programs that we were doing earlier, that we are doing now, will continue to remain free. First level is a basic level. Here, you can be our supporter by paying rupees 199 per month. This membership gives you certain perks and benefits. The perks include unique badges in front of your name, a live show from Mr. Sujit Nair and from Mr. Akhilesh Bhargava per month for our members. You can also vote in some exclusive members-only polls. Now the second level is Super Supporter. Here you can be our Super Supporter by paying rupees 3,999 per month. This membership will include every perk that comes with basic level. Additionally, our Super Supporters can be a part of a WhatsApp group where we can have discussions and suggestions on various topics. The second perk includes a gift pack with our merchandise. And the third perk is a Google Meet with Mr. Sujit Nair, where you can join the meet and ask your questions to Mr. Nair face to face. Lastly, if you like, we would give a shout out to our super supporters in our programs. So, hope to see you soon with our badges.